We will never turn our back on a single Scot.
We've got to wrestle with those challenges.
This is the same nonsense we have heard time and time again.
This is our country. Let's fix it together.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Planet Holyrood, the podcast that attempts to make sense of the world of Scottish politics. I'm Chris McCall, I'm the Deputy Political Editor at the Daily Record, and I'm standing in as host today while Paul Hutchin enjoys what he assures me is a working trip to London and not just a sightseeing tour around Westminster. Joining me in the studio today are two guests who need no introduction to regular Planet Holyrood listeners. On my left, we have Mark Smith, the head of news at the Daily Record, and on my right, Douglas Dickie, the content editor at the Scottish Daily Express. Now, to kick things off this week, I need to talk about, everyone's favourite erratic New York real estate developer, Donald J. Trump, and specifically what on earth other saner governments can do to stand up to a US president who's determined to just grab bits of other countries to please himself. Now, you're wondering, well, what's the Scottish politics angle to all that? And, this week we had Hannah Burdell, who I'm sure you'll both remember was the SNP MP for Livingston until 2024. She suggested that Scotland could boycott the World Cup to send a message to Trump. Now, in fairness to Hannah Burdell, she's not alone in thinking this. Other serving MPs have suggested similar as well. Basically, there should be a total boycott of the World Cup. I mean, try to pluck an example out of there, maybe the 1980 Moscow Olympics before my time, but, we used to see sort of political boycotts of things like that back in the day. But Mark, politicians regularly come up with terrible ideas, and I know it's early days, but this surely ranks as one of the worst of 2026. Am I wrong?
No. I think the only way you're wrong is that saying it's the worst of 2026, because I would say this is the daftest political idea probably that I've heard in my many, many years floating about the Scottish news world. The idea that the Scotland fans and players would turn around and go, after waiting 28 years, and say, oh, let's no go, because we didn't like Donald Trump. Now, I bow to nobody in my dislike of Donald Trump. The man's a maniac, and he's turning the world into a very unpleasant place. But the idea that Scotland wouldn't go to this World Cup because of him, as if it's his World Cup. It's not his World Cup. It's our World Cup. It belongs to every player, every fan, every country on earth. The idea that the World Cup would be somehow boycotted because of him is just a nonsense. He'd probably lap that up, apart from anything else. So tactically, it's inept. Practically, it's completely stupid. And apart from anything else, it would ruin what's going to be the best summer of sport we've had for
20
years. So, no. It's a terrible idea, and it maybe tells you why Hannah Bardell's no longer in politics.
I don't think you're the only person that surmised that. Dougie, I mean, on the point that Mark makes, would it even make any odds if, say, Scotland or indeed other nations, like, say, I don't know, a handful of them turned around and said, you know what, we're not going to bother coming?
Well, I think it actually would send a powerful message, but I agree with Smitty. I think it's nonsense. By the way, the most interesting thing is obviously we made sure that they're not there yet, but Denmark could yet qualify for the World Cup,
yes,
which would be, a really interesting dynamic there. I'm going to go slightly off piste. First thing to say is no, Scotland should not boycott the World Cup. Neither should England. It's a ridiculous suggestion. But I kind of admire someone who said something that she must have known how unpopular this is going to be, but she's kind of sticking with her guns on it. And I do think there's a wee bit of selective opinioning in this. Had Scotland been at the last 5 World Cups, would it be a bit more palatable to suggest it? If Scotland weren't there, would Stephen Flynn, who actually a rarity among politicians, someone who is actually a football fan, would he maybe be cheekily suggesting that England shouldn't go at the moment? The Scottish Greens for example, have made a big deal about the King's visit, and they made a big deal about Trump's business interest here in Scotland. I'm not sure if it's happening this year, but I know the DP World Tour had a tournament at Trump's course in Aberdeen last year. I'm sure that's going to be in the mix. I asked the Scottish Greens if they would support a boycott of the World Cup, and they just ignored it. So it's obviously a case of we think we should take action against Donald Trump, but not when it comes to that one thing that everyone likes, that everyone's really
I take your point,
looking forward to. And if you're talking about, boycotts against other countries in the sporting arena, we've heard people, talk about Israel, for example, then it goes to, the next logical step may well be to say that a boycott of the World Cup is something that can be thought of. It won't happen. It shouldn't happen. If we're not going to boycott bloody Russia and Qatar, we're certainly not going to boycott, or people aren't going to boycott America. And certainly right now, and I think Smitty's right. Donald Trump has shown himself now to be a complete maniac over these last few weeks.
I'm glad you've come around on that.
Well, my opinion was always that he was all talk, but his actual actions. But this is. I think this Greenland stuff has went kind of beyond that. Although I've read a few guys who worked with him in his first administration saying, "Oh, this will just be his way of getting into a bargaining position to get more influence in Greenland." But at the end of the day, it still is all talk right now. He's not actually done anything about it. Yeah. So to boycott a World Cup because he said something, I think would be, monumentally pointless. I don't think it's as outrageous a suggestion as
should just say that Hannah Bardell's former Westminster colleague Stephen Flynn, who is the Westminster leader of the SNP, he did not agree with Hannah's take. And quote, he's pretty certain that most Scots would consider a boycott of the World Cup to be quite low down the priority list in terms of how you respond to the president. And kind of what you said here, Dickie, without being flippant, we have boycotted the World Cup proactively since 1998, and I'm not entirely sure that's a route that we want to go down again. But just to kind of round this off, if we're not going to boycott the World Cup, and I say we, I mean Scotland, I mean the UK in general, and as you say, it is all talk at the minute, but these are uncertain times. How do you stand up to Donald Trump? I'm not expecting necessarily to have the answer, but if we're not going to boycott sporting tournaments, what do we do?
I mean, that is. I don't. We at the Express have obviously been, I think, rightly critical of Sir Keir Starmer, but this is in one occasion I really don't envy him.
No,
I think he's between a rock and a hard place. I think the European leaders are between a rock and a hard place. I think there's a hope that this is again just a Trump tactic to extract something. I think it's got more to do with the minerals that are in Greenland than it's getting to do with the kind of military. I think these things are required for AI and how we're going to run the world in the coming 100 years, and Greenland might find itself at the kind of centre of that. I honestly don't have a clue. Like, it's a real difficult one. Fair enough, I mentioned the King's visit earlier on, and even though I said that the Greens were being a bit hypocritical on it, I think that is something that should be looked at, even though, again, it is just words. I think we should be looking at that. Denmark's a close ally. One of the ironies of this is that Denmark's been one of the US's closest allies through the last kind of 30 years as well. I mean, Denmark's not been one of these kind of, some European countries I think can get quite sniffy towards the United States, despite being, allies, part of NATO. Denmark's not one of them. If you're going to pick a fight with a European nation, Denmark seems a really weird one to kind of go about it.
I think a signpost to the new world we're facing and a way maybe to negotiate through it without catastrophe was in Mark Carney's speech, the Canadian Prime Minister. It's worth watching. I don't know if any of the viewers keep a close eye on the speeches of the Canadian Prime Minister. Probably not, if they've got any sense. But this was a speech that's worth listening to, even if you can just catch up with it. He's basically saying that the rules-based international order that we all think has been there since the Second World War almost is a mirage, is a myth.
Yeah,
it's always been based on. In the Cold War, it was based on, America versus the USSR, and since the Cold War ended, it's basically been based on American hegemony being used to impose their power on countries all over the world.
Yeah.
And Carney's point, I think, is now that it's being imposed on us, as in, the Canadas, the European Union. We don't like it, but that's been the realpolitik in the world for many decades. And in a way, the only difference is that Trump's now turned it on us.
Yeah.
And his point is that the Europe and Canada and other sort of what you might call, secondary powers, if you like, need to start thinking about their own defence and need to start working together to create a world order which is based on humanity and rights and the rule of law. And that would, I think, his speech might or might not, I hope it does provide a way forward for countries.
So Carney said, not to read the whole thing, but just I think quite an important point. He said middle powers must act together because if we're not at the table, we're on the menu.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so I think we can all agree who he's aiming that at.
Yes.
I'm sure we'll talk a lot about Donald Trump and the World Cup again in the coming weeks and months before the summer. So setting that aside just now, to move on to one of the longer running political scandals of recent times in Scotland, and it's the issue of Glasgow's £1 billion super hospital, the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital, which regular listeners and anyone who follows the news in Scotland will know has been plagued by issues since it first started accepting patients way back in April 2015. Now, the date of that opening is important. We'll come back to it. But just to remind ourselves, without going into too much detail, there is a public inquiry ongoing. Its last evidence session is today. So very, very timely. And that was called back in 2020 by the then SNP Health Secretary, Jean Freeman. And it followed several deaths of vulnerable patients, including 2 children, which were linked to infections caused by contaminated water. And for years, NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde, who obviously run the hospital, just bluntly denied there was any problem. They said there was no contaminated water. This was not the root of infections. But then last week, we did have something of a U-turn on that when they said that there was a causal connection to increased infections. That was admitted at the weekend, which was viewed as a screeching U-turn. But their KC, who was given evidence inquiry, then tried to clarify it and blame the media, saying that there was no definite link between the hospital environment and specific individual cases, but not to dwell on that too much. There was still a significant shift by NHS bosses.
Yeah, I think the word probable might have been used, which is, legal speak for
Definitely.
Exactly. Exactly. They knew full well all along that the contaminated water was indeed linked to the death of these poor kids and the sickness that applied to other people. I mean, just as a news editor, you probably had the same thing, Dougie. You would have them on complaining, because we've maybe mentioned in a piece, because we obviously led the charge on exposing the scandal around Millie Main at the Record.
Yep.
And, we've done a lot with Millie's mum, Kimberly, and it was clear that there was a link. They used to phone up, how dare you threaten? There was threats of legal action. I think at one point, if we repeated it, for them just to turn around now and say, actually, there is a probable link. It's not just dishonest. It gets to the heart of what's wrong in the Scottish body politic, which is there are too many organisations who are untouched by criticism. They're untouched by the threat of getting sacked.
Yep.
They just mosey along, and there's a culture of secrecy and suppressing of important public information. Now, all of that leads towards a kind of rotten political and corporate and civic culture in Scotland.
Yep.
And by the way, Scotland isn't a corrupt country. Scotland's quite an honest place. I mean, all the international comparisons are that Scotland's a good place to do business. It's a good place to it's a place that doesn't suffer massive amounts of corruption, but that festering secrecy is eating away at that reputation. And the Scottish government, frankly, has not done enough to counter that. And they need to start sacking people. They need to start sacking people at NHS Fife. They need to start sacking people at NHS Glasgow. And I'm not talking doctors and nurses at the front line who do great work. I'm talking about the idiots who run these public organisations.
I mean, I think a few of them in the NHS, while not sacked, have been quietly given early retirement. Because just the second statement that was significant by NHS bosses this week, and I'll come at you on this, Dougie, was that in their closing statement, this was a written submission to the inquiry, the health board, which is under new management. So maybe I think there has been some people at the top now who have said, well, this position we've taken for so long, frankly, isn't sustainable.
Yeah.
They said, and I quote, pressure was applied to open the hospital on time and on budget, and it is now clear the hospital opened too early. It was not ready. So the question is, Dougie, where was this pressure coming from?
Well, I think we know where it was coming from. It was coming from the very top of government, which at the time was Nicola Sturgeon. I think it opened just a few weeks before the general election
So
in
started taking patients
2015.
in April 2015.
Yep.
The official opening was, I think, July.
July.
But when Scots went to the polls, it was a big news story saying new hospital.
It was functioning.
Yeah, it was functioning. Yeah.
And, we look at who the health secretary was at the time, was Jean Freeman.
No, she came later. I believe it was Shona Robinson. Yeah.
And obviously the finance minister at the time was John Swinney. So we're talking about two people there in that circumstance who are still at the heart of government, and one who barely bothers her bum to turn up at Holyrood. And they have questions to answer. I know today the Tories have called on Sturgeon to make a personal statement to Holyrood, and I think everyone, I know you're not a fan of the Conservatives, but I think even you could get behind that.
Oh, aye. I think they're right in this circumstance to really try and hold the SNP government to account, not only on their response to the obvious mistakes that were made, but the SNP government needs to come out and be completely transparent about why certain decisions were made, why they put pressure on people to open that hospital early.
And Labour, of course, want all the documents relating to it published. And I think it might be Anna Sarwar who said it, or maybe it was Jackie Bailey, and I can agree with him. I think this might be the biggest scandal of devolution, of the devolution era. And it seems to be bubbling away right now, and it's bubbling away at a really bad time for the SNP, so they'll be really keen to get this buried. But I think this is something that's going to kind of crack out that Holyrood bubble.
I mean, I think we should add, maybe for balance, it's not like me, I know, but we should add that I think the motives of people like Nicola Sturgeon and the health secretary at the time, whether it was Freeman or Robinson, I think they were both involved, in some shape or form. I'm sure their motives were pure. I don't think they thought, let's get this hospital open, even though we know it's a death trap. I doubt that.
No.
I doubt that.
I think they wanted to open. I think they wanted it functioning for the general election. I don't think there's any doubt about that. I'm not saying they thought it was a death trap.
It was slightly delayed. It should have started taking patients in 2014.
Yeah.
And obviously it was a huge project, merged a number of smaller hospitals. And as you say, Smitty, I'm sure the intention of we've got this new hospital needs to get up and running.
Yeah, the demand for it.
Yeah, there was a demand for it. Of course,
people in Glasgow were screaming out for this thing to be open. It could well be they were simply responding to the public's, especially in the Glasgow area, the public's real desire to get this thing opened. However, that should never have superseded safety concerns, and it should never have got in the way. The political desire for it should never have got in the way of the real life practicalities.
You'll know this better than me, Smitty. The hospital in Edinburgh was the sick kids. So it was the eye hospital. The opening of that was delayed.
Aye,
because basically it was over. Much of the fears, and we were just talking about the Queen Elizabeth. Yeah, they flared up again, but instead of taking the risk, they parked it to get the.
And it's a difficult thing for politicians, isn't it? You know, if you park it, you get absolutely hammered,
especially in an election.
You know. Yeah, so maybe they took a calculation that it's better to just get this place open.
Of course.
However, I think the key thing for me is the attempt to then rewrite history and make out as if there was never a problem. That to me is just beyond the pale.
I mean, Smith talks about this culture of secrecy in Scottish public life. It comes from the top. That comes from the top as well. It comes from the SNP. It's been this way now for 18 years. I'm sure, Chris, you've had many FOIs as I have that are more, redaction than actual copy. They keep running into the Scottish Information Commissioner. They keep getting chinned by him. They keep losing these kind of cases with him. So it comes from the very top, and people at NHS Greater Glasgow and Clydie, people at NHS Fife, they're taking their lead from the Scottish Government, and that's why that's one of the many reasons I think we should be kicking this rotten government out come May.
Come the election, voters will have to look at this
And
and
I think
other
this
issues.
will resonate with voters.
Absolutely. Folk will read it and go, well, why the hell was this allowed to fester like that for years? The key point is that I think the we've become, in essence, a one-party state. And I think governments who have been in power too long, just by their very nature, start to think that they're unbeatable and that their word is law. You know, I think if the SNP are going to, they might well do well in this next election, by the way, they'll probably win it. But if they really want to connect with voters again properly, I think they've got to admit that they became stale and they became slightly self-serving in government. And that's a bad look for a government. And I don't think it's really what the SNP membership or the people who join the SNP, I think they're quite idealistic. I think they want to do the right thing in many circumstances, but they've grown stale through being in government for a long time. And that culture of secrecy is part of that wider malaise.
And we should say that the findings of this inquiry, well, I mean, it'll take several months. I mean, if it gets published this year, I'd be impressed. But it'll be after the election is when we'll actually
Yes.
people will be criticised in the report. Who they are, I don't know.
Yeah.
Just to talk briefly, though, on one final subject, after the last episode of this podcast was recorded, Nigel Farage made one of his flying visits to Scotland, to Kirkcaldy, specifically where he confirmed Malcolm Offord as the first leader of reform in Scotland. And since then, we've had Robert Jenrick with his smooth transition over to the Tories. But just as a seasoned follower of reform, Dougie, just how many more Tory defections can the public stomach before they think, well, this is just the Conservatives 2.0?
Well, I think that's actually Reform's problem now, because Reform now just looks like a bunch of opportunists who are desperate to kind of cling on. Well, they're desperate to cling on to their seat. Chris, as you know, I was there on Thursday. It was dominated by Jenrick, which I think Malcolm Offord, with hindsight, might be quite happy about. I don't think he was very happy at the time. But, you know, if you're reduced to quoting Deacon Blue to kind of get yourself through the day, then I think, you know, you've got major issues. And I actually think they were, for the first time, I think you could see their bubble burst a bit up here. I think they're so woolly on the union.
I have to say I was surprised by that. I mean, I know that they do hope to attract disaffected SNP voters, but I wouldn't have thought there'd be enough of them not to take a harder line when it comes to an indirect.
I can't make up my mind whether that's a deliberate tactic, as you say, to maybe pick up some of the SNP voters who might not even turn out, or whether Farage just doesn't give a toss.
I think I think they want to present themselves as a certain section of the Scottish electorate as the arch unionist party, but in essence, they're the opposite of a unionist party. I get the impression that Farage would be only too happy if Scotland stuck up the border post at Berwick, and he could then be eternally the leader of a rump UK. And I think he sees Scotland as a block to that, you know. So I think he is weak on the union, ironically.
It's funny saying that, Smitty, because I think I read in a paper this week that he wants to shut Holyrood down, actually, and take complete control of Scotland.
Swinney, that was our front page. Thanks for pointing out.
Complete opposite of that.
Swinney's concern is that he would close Holyrood down. I mean, the way that we've just been talking there about how Holyrood's no held in great esteem, but I think he sees that as a way to garner support from those who are just anti-politics, because Reform's big appeal is that they are the outsiders, that they want to noise things up, and by saying get rid of Holyrood, he's definitely playing into that anti-political idea. But I think his view of Scottish politics is, how can it help me get power in the UK? I think that's his only calculation. And I think by saying, well, actually, I might give a referendum to the Scots on independence, he's just playing that game, you know.
Yeah. Ironically, the last poll suggested that support for getting rid of Holyrood might be higher than support for the Greens and for the Lib Dems. So
it's a low
John
bar.
Swinney, but John Swinney may well have pushed hundreds of thousands of voters into Reform's arms with that comment.
He may well have, but he's speaking to his base.
Yes.
Okay, well, I think we'll leave it there, because I'm sure we'll have a lot more to say about Reform and Nigel Farage
in the coming weeks. They will have to.
But thanks very much to Mark and Dougie for joining me. Thanks also to Henrik Brandt from the Daily Record video team for producing this episode. I'm obliged to say that you can listen to this and all Planet Holyrood episodes on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Watch it on the Daily Records YouTube channel, and don't forget to follow us on Instagram and TikTok for the latest news and the best bits of the podcast. That's all from me just now. Paul Hutch will be back next week, so cheerio.
We will never turn our back on a single Scot.
We've got to wrestle with those challenges.
This is the same nonsense we have heard time and time again.
This is our country. Let's fix it together.